ripple echo.
And we all have this feeling that I came into this world. Now, it isn't true. You came out of this world.
Series 1, Episode 3, Power, Trade, and the Rule of Law. As presidential power stretches further into economic terrain, a counterforce has emerged, not in Congress but in the courts. This episode we follow a constitutional resistance movement led by the new Civil Liberties Alliance, a group challenging the legal scaffolding behind executive trade authority itself. Their argument: that statutes like IEEPA, Section 232, and Section 301 have wandered too far from legislative intent and too close to unchecked power. The machine has followed the filings, the doctrines, and the dissents. Let's see what it has to say.
Think about trade for a second. It used to feel like it was mostly about economics containers on ships, prices, market share.
Right, just business as usual.
But increasingly, trade isn't just about commerce anymore. It's become this incredibly potent tool of national power, deeply tangled up with concepts like security, resilience, and global strategy.
Yeah, we're definitely seeing countries turn trade rules often designed, for diplomacy and cooperation into weapons in economic battles.
That's right. The fundamental question driving a lot of current policy is, how are countries wielding trade policy, not just for plain old business, but specifically for strategic leverage in the global arena?
Exactly. We're going to pull apart two specific powerful U.S. trade tools that have been front and center in recent years.
One is Section 232, which is framed explicitly around national security concerns. The other is Section 301, designed to tackle what the U.S. sees as unfair trade practices by other countries.
We'll dig into where these tools come from, understand how they actually work step by step, and look at the real-world instances where they've been put into practice.
We're talking steel, aluminum, semiconductors, even cars.
And crucially, we'll explore who actually benefits and, perhaps more pointedly, who pays the price when these strategic tariffs are implemented.
Because these aren't just abstract laws on paper, right?
Not at all. They are measures with real, tangible consequences that can turn something as seemingly mundane as a global supply chain into a potential battleground.
Our mission today is to give you a clear, well-informed picture of these powerful tools and their impacts. Think of it as a shortcut to understanding how trade became a strategic weapon.
Let's jump right in by laying the groundwork for these two distinct tools.
So where does the U.S. government even get the power to mess with imports and put on tariffs in the first place?
Well, constitutionally, that power firmly rests with Congress. The U.S. Constitution, way back in Article 1, Section 8, gives Congress the clear authority to regulate commerce with foreign nations and to impose duties and taxes.
So, Congress is the boss of trade policy. Fundamentally.
Constitutionally, yes. But the world of international trade moves incredibly fast.
Right.
To allow for more agile responses to global economic shifts and challenges than, waiting for Congress to pass a new law every time, Congress has, over many decades, delegated substantial authority to the president.
Okay.
This allows the executive branch to impose or adjust tariffs under specific legislative frameworks that they've created.
And that delegation of power to the president? Is that controversial or just accepted?
Oh, it absolutely is controversial, and it creates this persistent dynamic in U.S. trade policy making.
How so?
Well, the constitutional power of Congress coexists with the significant discretion granted to the president through statutes like Section 232 and Section 301.
Oh.
This arrangement facilitates swift executive action against perceived trade threats, but it also constantly fuels debates about the appropriate balance of power and whether Congress has given away too much authority.
You mean like politically?
Exactly. You'll see this tension reflected in legislative proposals that sometimes pop up, aiming either to pull back on or occasionally expand presidential tariff powers. It's a fundamental characteristic of the landscape.
Okay, so knowing that Congress delegates this power, let's zoom in on the first of these two tools, Section 232. Where does this one come from?
Section 232 has its legal home in a law passed during the height of the Cold War, the Trade Expansion Act of 1962.
1962.
Its origins directly reflect the concerns of that era that certain imports could potentially harm U.S. security.
So it's born out of a national security context, not really about fair trade initially.
Precisely. The core idea is that the president is authorized to adjust imports, things like tariffs or quotas, If the Secretary of Commerce conducts an investigation and finds that imports are coming into the U.S. in such quantities or under such circumstances as to threaten to impair U.S. national security.
Threaten to impair. That sounds incredibly broad. How is national security defined in this law?
And that's a critical point, and arguably where a lot of the controversy comes from. The law doesn't define national security narrowly.
It doesn't.
No, it explicitly tells officials they must recognize the close relation of the economic welfare of the nation to our national security.
Wait, so it's not just about military hardware or things directly used by the Pentagon. It's also about the health of the U.S. economy.
Exactly. The key insight here is that the definition is deliberately flexible. It includes factors like U.S. defense requirements and domestic industry capacity, yes.
Right, the obvious stuff.
But also the impact of foreign competition on the nation's economic welfare, on essential skills, investment, employment, and the viability of what are considered critical industries like steel, aluminum, and automobiles.
That level of flexibility.
Right.
Critics must have a field day with that.
They do. Critics argue this broad language creates a flexible, some would say vague legal basis that really blurs the lines.
Is it security or something else?
Right. Is it a legitimate security concern? Is it just industrial policy designed to help specific domestic industries? Or is it simply protectionism? The application of Section 232 to things like automobiles or investigations into products like lumber or copper shows just how broadly this can be interpreted, extending far beyond purely military goods.
And if someone tries to challenge a presidential action under Section 232 in court, how does that usually go?
Well, courts have generally shown a lot of deference to the executive branch in these cases.
Meaning they back off.
Basically, yes. The courts tend to trust the president's judgment on security matters and don't second-guess it easily. They've typically upheld actions unless it's shown the president clearly misconstrues the statute.
Yeah.
This combination of a broad statutory definition and courts largely stepping back gives the executive branch significant power here. It's why some critics talk about it being a potential blank check.
Wow, okay. So that's Section 232, security-focused, broad definition, lots of presidential power, and courts usually stay out of it. Now let's turn to the other major tool, Section 301. Where does that come from and what's its purpose?
Section 301 comes from the Trade Act of 1974. It's often referred to collectively as Section 301.
Yep.
Its purpose is quite different from 232. Section 301 is one of the primary tools the U.S. uses to enforce its rights under international trade agreements and, importantly, to address foreign government practices that the U.S. sees as unfair barriers to its commerce.
Okay, so 232 is security, 301 is about fighting unfairness.
That's the core distinction. Section 301 targets several categories of foreign practices specifically called out in the law.
Such as?
First, if a foreign government violates a trade agreement and denies the U.S. rights or benefits under it. Second, unjustifiable practices. These are foreign acts or policies that violate U.S. international legal rights, even if not part of a formal agreement, and burden U.S. commerce. Third, unreasonable practices. These are considered unfair or inequitable, even if they don't violate U.S. legal rights, but still burden U.S. commerce.
What counts as unreasonable?
Well, the law gives examples like denying market access, inadequate protection for U.S. intellectual property, forcing U.S. companies to transfer technology, state-sponsored anti-competitive stuff, or denying worker rights.
Can you give us a recent example of what the U.S. considered an unreasonable practice under Section 301?
Yes, a good recent example is the USTR's investigation into China's practices in the maritime, logistics, and shipbuilding sectors.
Right, I remember reading about that.
That investigation concluded that China's actions were unreasonable because they displace foreign firms and lessen competition. The USTR has proposed potential actions for that case, including imposing certain fees or tariffs.
Interesting. And are there other categories?
And finally, Section 301 also covers discriminatory practices by a foreign government that burden U.S. commerce.
Like with Section 232 and national security, does the language in Section 301, terms like unreasonable or burdens U.S. commerce, also get interpreted broadly?
Yes, they are not narrowly defined. This gives the USTR, that's the U.S. Trade Representative's Office, significant flexibility to investigate and potentially retaliate against a wide range of foreign government policies they deem problematic.
So it's adaptable.
Proponents like that flexibility, arguing it allows Section 301 to adapt to new trade challenges that don't fit neatly into pre-existing categories. However, critics argue this also means the statute can be applied subjectively or used more for leverage than strictly enforcing established trade rules.
Has the way Section 301 is used changed over time?
Significantly, yes. After the World Trade Organization, the WTO, was established in 1995, Section 301 was often used domestically to build cases and gather evidence before taking a dispute to the WTO's multilateral system.
So it was more of a preparation tool for WTO disputes back then.
Exactly. But the recent assertive and broad application of Section 301, particularly against China starting around 2018, marks a really significant shift towards unilateral action.
What a shift.
Well, in these cases, the U.S. government has often cited perceived weaknesses or lack of relevant rules in the WTO system, especially when dealing with non-market economies. And the decision by the U.S. to appeal an adverse WTO ruling on its Section 301 tariffs into the void, essentially appealing into a non-functional part of the WTO system, is seen by many as a move to neutralize WTO legal challenges and underscore this strategic pivot towards unilateralism.
That seems like a pretty big deal for how global trade rules work.
It is. It signals a willingness by the U.S. to act outside or parallel to the traditional multilateral system when it feels its interests aren't being adequately addressed within that system.
Okay, that's a great overview of where they come from and their core purposes. Let's take a quick breath here.
Sounds good. So just to recap quickly, we have Section 232, born from Cold War security concerns, giving the president broad power based on a flexible definition of national security that includes economic welfare. Courts generally defer to the executive on this.
And Section 301, designed later to fight what the U.S. sees as unfair foreign trade practices, managed by the USTR, targeting specific actions by other countries. Its use has shifted recently towards more unilateral action, partly citing WTO limitations.
These different starting points and legal structures really shape how they are used and the kinds of debates they spark.
Absolutely. Let's talk about the nuts and bolts of how they're actually put into action. Who's in charge of running the investigations for each?
For Section 232, the investigation is led by the Department of Commerce.
Commerce, okay.
And a really important part of the process here is that the Secretary of Commerce has a mandatory requirement to consult with the Secretary of Defense.
Keeping the security link. And for Section 301?
That falls under the authority of a U.S. trade representative, the USTR.
Okay, different agencies.
Right. You can see how the different areas of expertise line up. Commerce, consulting with defense for the security-focused 232, and USTR, with its trade law and negotiation background, for the unfair practices-focused 301.
How do these investigations get started? Can anyone just ask for one?
A Section 232 investigation can kick off in a few ways. If another government department asks for it, if an interested party, like a domestic industry or union, applies for one, or the Secretary of Commerce can even start one themselves.
Is self-initiated.
Yes. A prominent example is the Section 232 investigation into steel imports, which was actually self-initiated by the Secretary of Commerce back in 2017.
Okay. And for Section 301, how do those usually start?
Section 301 investigations often start based on a formal petition filed by an interested person, again, companies, industry associations, or labor unions.
Like the shipbuilding case you mentioned.
Exactly. The recent investigation into China's shipbuilding sector began in April 2024 after a petition from 5 U.S. labor unions. USTR also has the power to self-initiate an investigation. If they get a petition, USTR has 45 days to decide whether to launch a formal investigation.
What does the investigation itself involve? What happens during that period?
For Section 232, Commerce conducts a comprehensive investigation, including that mandatory consultation with the Department of Defense.
Right.
They'll look at all those factors we mentioned: defense needs, domestic capacity, economic welfare, and so on. There's a public comment period and sometimes hearings where affected parties can present their case.
Is there a deadline?
Yes, Commerce is required to finish its investigation and send a report to the President within 270 days.
Okay, 9 months. What about the 301 process?
For Section 301, the USTR leads the investigation. They're generally required to request consultations with the foreign governments involved, seeking to resolve the issue diplomatically first.
So they try talking first.
Usually, yes. USTR gathers information from the foreign government and U.S. stakeholders and provides opportunities for public input. They also have to get advice from private sector advisory committees.
What if it involves breaking a trade deal?
If the case is about another country breaking a trade agreement, USTR is generally required to try and use formal dispute settlement procedures under that agreement, like going through the WTO process.
Okay, so Commerce for 232, USTR for 301. Different ways they can start, different processes. How does the president fit into the final decision? Is it the same for both?
No, this is another big difference. For Section 232, if Commerce's report finds that imports are a security threat, the president then has 90 days to make the final call.
90 days.
And this is where the president's power is particularly broad under 232. They don't have to follow Commerce's recommendations.
Really? They could just ignore the report.
They can. They can put tariffs on, set quotas, do something else entirely, or even decide to do nothing. If the president decides to act, those measures have to be implemented quickly within 15 days.
15 days. Fast.
And the president also has to explain their decision or inaction to Congress within 30 days. Historically, just to give you a sense, between 1962 and 2020, Commerce made 14 affirmative findings, but the president only chose to act in 9 of those cases.
So that shows the president really is the ultimate, very powerful decider in 232.
Yes, much more directly and with broader explicit discretion than in 301. Under Section 301, USTR makes the formal determination on whether a foreign practice is actionable and decides on the specific retaliatory measures.
USTR decides.
USTR makes the call, but it's done subject to the direction of the president, if any.
If any, so the president can step in.
Correct. The president can direct USTR, but USTR is the main statutory decision maker. A key difference here is that action under Section 301 is actually mandatory if USTR finds that a trade agreement has been violated or a practice is unjustifiable and burdens U.S. commerce.
Mandatory action. That sounds like a big difference from the president's broad discretion in 232.
It is. Section 301 has these specific triggers for action. However, USTR can waive this mandatory action under specific circumstances.
Loopholes.
Well, specific conditions. Like if taking action would seriously harm U.S. national security, if the foreign country is fixing the problem, or if taking action would hurt the U.S. economy disproportionately more than it helps.
Okay, so there's some flexibility, but it starts from a place of mandatory action in certain cases.
Exactly. Whereas the president's final decision under Section 232 is far more open-ended. Actions under Section 301 are typically put in place within 30 days of USTR's determination.
What kind of actions can they actually take? Is it always tariffs?
Tariffs are the preferred remedy under Section 301. The law directs USTR to give preference to imposing duties, and importantly, it doesn't specify a maximum tariff rate.
No ceiling.
Nope. Other possible actions include withdrawing trade agreement concessions or reaching binding agreements with the foreign government. The recent China maritime case even suggested imposing service fees on certain vessels.
Interesting. And for 232?
For Section 232, the authority is even broader. The president can impose tariffs, quotas, or any other import adjustments deemed necessary. Very wide latitude.
And do these measures apply to imports from specific countries or potentially any country?
Section 232 tariffs can be applied to imports from any country if the commerce investigation finds a national security threat related to those imports. It can be product-specific or cover a broader range of goods from multiple countries.
Okay, 232 is potentially global. What about 301?
Section 301 actions, conversely, are specifically targeted at the practices of a particular foreign country. They are typically country-specific, though they could be used to address a similar practice by multiple countries, like those investigations into digital services taxes that many nations have adopted.
Is there any kind of expiration date or review for these tariffs? Do they just stay on forever?
This is another key procedural difference. Section 232 actions do not have an explicit statutory sunset provision. The president decides how long they last.
No automatic end date for 232.
Correct. Section 301 actions, however, automatically terminate after 4 years, unless the original petitioner or the affected domestic industry ask for them to continue.
A 4-year review.
Yes. If requested, USTR conducts a review to see if the action should remain in place. There's no upper limit on how many times a 301 action can be extended through these reviews. But that 4-year review is a significant procedural check built into Section 301.
Okay, that's a lot of important detail on how they work.
Right.
Let's quickly recap the core operational differences before we move on.
Right, so we have commerce with mandatory defense consultation, leading Section 232, driven by a national security rationale. The president has exceptionally broad final authority here, and there's no automatic sunset for the measures.
And USTR leads on Section 301, driven by countering unfair trade practices. This involves consultations with foreign governments, has specific mandatory action triggers, though USTR has waiver possibilities and presidential direction.
Right.
And is subject to that 4-year review process.
These distinct processes, lead agencies, and triggers are fundamental to understanding the outcomes and debates surrounding each tool.
How do these U.S. domestic tools fit into the broader international trade system, especially with the WTO? Do other countries just accept them?
Oh, definitely not. Both Section 232 and Section 301 actions have frequently led to disputes being filed against the U.S. at the WTO.
How does the U.S. defend Section 232 actions at the WTO? That security claim seems tricky internationally.
It is. Section 232 measures are often challenged by trading partners as violating WTO obligations. The U.S. typically defends these by invoking the national security exception found in Article XY of the JTT, which is a key part of WTO rules.
Article 1.
Yes. Now, this exception is largely self-judging, meaning a country largely decides for itself what constitutes a security threat, but its scope and how broadly it can be applied have been the subject of intense debate within the WTO framework.
And Section 301 challenges at the WTO. How are those handled?
Unilateral actions taken under Section 301, meaning those without prior authorization from the WTO, like the broad tariffs imposed on China based on IP practices, may be challenged at the WTO for violating U.S. commitments.
Like treating all partners equally.
Exactly, like most favored nation treatment, or exceeding agreed upon tariff limits, known as bound rates. However, it's worth noting that Section 301 can also be used domestically to implement retaliatory measures that have been explicitly authorized by the WTO after the U.S. successfully wins a case against another member.
But you mentioned earlier that recent uses of Section 301 seem to be moving away from the WTO focus.
Yes, that's a key insight about the strategic shift. The recent extensive and direct imposition of tariffs under Section 301, particularly against China, does mark a departure towards a more assertive and often unilateral U.S. trade strategy.
And they're citing problems with the WTO.
The U.S. government has sometimes explicitly cited perceived weaknesses in WTO dispute settlement or the lack of adequate WTO rules to address certain practices, especially those of non-market economies. As we discussed, the U.S. decision to effectively put WTO legal recourse on hold by appealing adverse rulings into the void.
Right, the non-functional appeal body.
Underscores this strategic pivot towards unilateralism, which has significant implications for how global trade governance functions.
It really highlights a willingness to act outside or parallel to the multilateral system when the U.S. feels that system isn't effectively addressing its concerns.
Precisely. It's a major shift.
Okay, this has been incredibly helpful in understanding the legal foundation and operational differences. Let's wrap up this chapter with a mega recap.
To restate the core identities of these two powerful tools, Section 232 is fundamentally the national security tool. It gives the president immense power based on a broad definition of security that importantly includes economic welfare to restrict imports from anywhere if they're deemed a threat.
Think of it as the U.S. trying to wrap its economy in a layer of legal Kevlar for protection, even if it makes things less flexible or more costly inside.
Right, and Section 301 is the unfair trade cop tool. It's managed by the USTR and specifically targets practices by foreign governments that the U.S. sees as unfair barriers to its trade.
And while it involves consultations and can lead to WTO cases, its recent use has shifted towards more unilateral action, often citing WTO limitations.
Can you see now how these different starting points, these distinct legal bases and implementing agency security versus unfairness, Commerce President versus USTR, no sunset versus review, naturally lead to different types of actions and different kinds of debates about their legitimacy and effectiveness?
Absolutely. It's like one is designed as a defensive shield and the other as an enforcement mechanism, but both can ultimately use tariffs as a weapon.
Exactly. And to lock in some of those key distinctions, let's run through those flashcard facts.
Okay, flashcard facts. Literature Section 232, National Security, broad.
Section 301, unfair trade practices, specific actions.
Right, 232 lead. Commerce, DoD consult.
A 301 lead, USTR, foreign gov consult.
232 president, final decider, broad discretion.
301 president, direction, USTR leads.
U32 sunset, none.
301 sunset, 4-year review.
So we've defined these two tools and how they work. Now let's really dig into the arguments made by those who champion the use of Section 232, the so-called national security tariffs. What is their core belief that justifies using trade policy in this way?
Their fundamental belief is a powerful one, and it's become increasingly prominent in recent years. Economic security, i.e. national security.
Okay, they see them as inseparable.
Yes. They argue that relying purely on free markets and global supply chains, while potentially efficient in theory, can sometimes hollow out critical domestic industries. And that, they say, makes a nation vulnerable, particularly in times of crisis or conflict.
So if the U.S. doesn't make certain things at home, even basic goods, It's not just an economic problem, it's a strategic military weakness.
That's precisely the argument. A central part of this view is about protecting the defense industrial base.
The DIB.
Right. Proponents contend that certain domestic industries like steel, aluminum, semiconductors, rare earth minerals, and others provide materials and components that are absolutely indispensable for building defense equipment and maintaining critical infrastructure.
And if we rely too much on other countries for those things, especially potential adversaries.
If the U.S. becomes too reliant on foreign suppliers, especially countries that could potentially be adversaries, these materials or products, they argue military readiness could be severely jeopardized in a crisis.
Makes sense.
Section 232 investigations explicitly assess U.S. defense requirements and whether domestic industries have the capacity to reliably supply those needs. For example, the Commerce Department's 2018 reports that led to the steel and aluminum tariffs warned that import dependence was undermining the ability of U.S. steel and aluminum industries to meet both defense and critical infrastructure requirements.
What are some specific examples they point to? Things we couldn't build without domestic supply.
They note that building ships for the Navy, armored vehicles, aircraft, and advanced weapon systems all require a reliable domestic source of these metals and components. From this perspective, maintaining a minimum viable production capacity here at home, even if it costs a bit more than importing, is seen not as economic inefficiency, but as a necessary strategic investment in national security.
It's the price you pay for preparedness.
That's the idea. They also highlight the inherent risk of supply cutoffs.
Being held hostage, basically.
Right. A hostile nation, knowing the U.S. depends on them for certain materials, could exploit that dependence in a crisis by embargoing supplies or manipulating prices and directly threaten U.S. defense preparedness.
It sounds like this argument extends beyond just direct military inputs, though. You mentioned supply chain resilience more broadly.
Yes, the argument definitely goes beyond immediate defense needs to safeguarding broader supply chains that are considered essential to the functioning of the country.
Like things we saw during the pandemic.
Exactly. Recent global shocks from geopolitical tensions to the pandemic have really exposed vulnerabilities in global supply networks for critical goods. Section 232 actions are presented as a tool to help fix these vulnerabilities and make supply chains more resilient.
How does that look in practice? How does 232 help there?
Well, a good example is the Biden administration's 2025 executive order focusing on critical minerals. It stressed that reliance on a small number of foreign suppliers for processed minerals created supply chain weaknesses that pose risks to national security, defense readiness, price stability, and economic prosperity.
So the idea is tariffs can spur domestic production.
Yes. By using import measures like tariffs or quotas, or even just the threat of them, the U.S. aims to encourage domestic production and reduce this kind of overdependence on specific foreign sources.
So the idea is to avoid being vulnerable to economic pressure or blackmail from another country, cut off from vital inputs.
That's a key part of the argument. Proponents often bring up the scenario of being cut off from vital inputs. Think rare earth elements needed for precision-guided munitions or advanced batteries during a conflict.
Right.
Creating more self-reliant and diverse supply chains, even if it means sacrificing some short-term global efficiency, is viewed as common-sense prudence against economic blackmail or wartime shortages.
So self-reliance equals less vulnerability.
That's the logic. A nation that has better control over its own supply of critical materials and products, they argue, is simply less vulnerable to external coercion and can better sustain its economy and military during a crisis.
There's also an argument that just having a strong overall economy is a component of national security, right? Not just specific industries.
Absolutely. That's the broader notion tying economic strength to national power. Proponents argue that a healthy domestic economy, including robust industrial employment and technological leadership, is the foundation that undergirds national security.
I remember President Trump saying something like that.
Yes, he captured this perspective when he said, "Economic vitality, growth, and prosperity at home is absolutely necessary for American power and influence abroad."
So losing key industries isn't just about jobs. It's about losing a piece of national power, weakening the foundation.
In this view, deindustrialization, or the decline of key industries, is seen as a national security liability because it erodes the country's capacity to project power globally and to recover quickly from major crises.
And that's why economic welfare is in the Section 232 language.
Exactly. Section 232's inclusion of economic welfare considerations reflects this logic. The argument is that sustained trade deficits or the collapse of strategic industries could lead to long-term unemployment and a loss of essential skills, which in turn could threaten to impair national security.
How did that play out with the steel tariffs specifically?
The fact sheet supporting the 2018 steel tariffs, for instance, explicitly argued that the tariffs would help domestic mills reopen and sustain a skilled workforce, thereby preserving essential industrial capabilities that might be needed in an emergency.
So it's a trade-off. Short-term efficiency versus long-term security.
That's how proponents frame it. They contend that you shouldn't sacrifice the long-term security of supply and industrial capacity for the sake of short-term market efficiency. In their view, using tariffs or import restrictions is a small, acceptable price to ensure the U.S. retains the economic resilience needed to withstand and effectively respond to a national security crisis.
What about dealing with unfair trade practices by other countries? How do proponents link that to the security argument, which is more of a Section 301 thing?
Well, another supporting argument for using 232 is that persistent unfair trade practices by other countries can evolve into a national security threat over the long term.
How so?
For instance, massive state-subsidized overcapacity in foreign steel production, largely from China, was cited as a major reason U.S. mills struggle to survive, potentially impairing security by weakening domestic capacity.
So practices like dumping or providing huge subsidies aren't just unfair business tactics. They're strategically harmful from a security perspective.
Exactly. Proponents argue that dumping and subsidies don't just hurt U.S. companies financially. They can also lead to a situation where critical supply is concentrated in the hands of potentially unfriendly nations, creating a vulnerability.
I remember Wilbur Ross talking about this.
Yes, former Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross stated that global overcapacity driven by foreign policies has an impact on our economy, and that Section 232 was used to examine its impact on our national security.
So tariffs become a countermeasure against economic aggression.
In this narrative, yes, tariffs become a necessary countermeasure against what is viewed as economic aggression by rivals. By invoking national security under 232, the U.S. signals that certain predatory trade behaviors, like flooding markets with subsidized goods specifically to eliminate U.S. industries, will be treated not just as trade disputes, but as strategic threats requiring a robust, potentially unilateral response.
Okay, so to sum up the core case for using Section 232, what's the bottom line for proponents?
In summary, proponents argue fiercely that without a strong domestic industrial base and secure supply chains for critical goods, national security is inherently compromised.
And global rules don't always cut it.
They view international trade commitments and the WTO as important, but not as absolutes that should prevent the U.S. from protecting itself if those commitments lead to dangerous dependencies on potential rivals. Invoking national security exceptions, like GATT Article XD1, is seen as justified and necessary when trade policy needs to serve strategic defense goals.
It definitely ties economic nationalism directly to national defense, making it a powerful political argument.
It does, and this perspective resonates strongly in political appeals focused on protecting domestic jobs and regaining control over vital industries.
Okay, let's pause here and reflect. So, the core arguments for using Section 232 are pretty clear. It's about protecting the military's ability to get essential supplies, ensuring supply chains are resilient against shocks or pressure, making sure the overall economy remains strong as a base for national power, and countering rivals who might use trade practices to weaken the U.S.
It's truly about viewing trade through a strategic, almost defensive lens. It reframes economic policy as a matter of national defense and resilience in a highly competitive global environment.
And this brings us back to a question we touched on earlier, one that sits at the heart of the debate. Based on these arguments we've heard, would you call this approach defense or disguised industrial policy? Hold on to that thought as we move into the critiques.
To the proponents we've just discussed, Section 232 is seen as a vital shield, intended to wrap the economy in a layer of legal Kevlar to ensure the nation can defend itself, both physically and economically, in a crisis.
It's about accepting what might be short-term costs for a crucial long-term strategic resilience, aiming to ensure that critical industries and supply lines can function even under pressure from rivals. The underlying idea is that dependency is dangerous, and trade policy is a legitimate and necessary tool to reduce that danger and secure critical supply chains for the nation's well-being and defense. Here are some flashcard facts to help reinforce those proponent arguments.
Okay, flashcard facts. Key proponents. Econ security, use 1. Protect defense industrial base.
Oh, key 232, use 2. Use 2, secure supply chain.
Well, key 232, use 3. Econ strength, net power.
Key 232, use 4. Counter unfair trade to security impact.
Analogies. Economic Kevlar, prudence versus short-term efficiency. So that's the case for using Section 232, grounded in the idea of economic security as national security. But as we hinted earlier, the application of this tool, particularly in recent years, has sparked enormous controversy. What is the central counter-argument made by critics? Well, the central counter-argument, voiced loudly by economists, U.S. trading partners, and many members of Congress, is that these measures often amount to thinly veiled protectionism.
Just protectionism with a different name.
That's the claim. And worse, they argue this protectionism comes with significant and often harmful side effects that actually undermine the U.S. economy.
Harmful side effects. How do they describe those? What kind of harm?
Critics primarily point to economic inefficiency and substantial costs imposed on the broader U.S. economy and its consumers. They argue that Section 232 tariffs, like most protectionist measures, introduce distortions that lead to economic costs far outweighing any localized benefits to the specific protected industries.
Can you give us a concrete example of how those costs play out? Like who pays?
Tariffs on steel and aluminum, for instance, directly translate into higher input costs for downstream manufacturers.
The companies that use the steel and aluminum.
Exactly. These are massive industries in the U.S., like automotive, machinery producers, and construction firms that rely heavily on these metals. This forces those manufacturers to pay more for their raw materials.
Which means higher prices for us.
Typically, yes. It leads to higher prices for their products, both for businesses buying their goods and ultimately for consumers. It also makes U.S. manufacturers less competitive against foreign rivals who aren't facing these same elevated input costs.
Have economists tried to measure these effects? Put numbers on it?
Yes, and the studies are often cited by critics. One analysis found that the 2018 steel and aluminum tariffs raised the cost of production for manufacturers, reduced employment in those industries, raised prices for consumers, and hurt exports.
So widespread effects.
These aren't small, isolated effects. They ripple through the economy.
And I remember hearing some striking numbers about the cost per job potentially saved in the protected industries.
That's a figure frequently highlighted by critics to underscore the inefficiency. The Peterson Institute for International Economics, for example, estimated that each steel job potentially saved by the 2018 tariffs came at an exorbitant cost to U.S. consumers, around $650,000 in higher prices.
Wow, $650,000 per job. That figure alone seems to fuel a lot of the criticism. Did the tariffs actually lead to job gains across the whole economy then? Or was it a wash?
This is where the net effect is really debated. While jobs might be supported in the steel or aluminum mills themselves, other economists have found that the tariffs actually led to a net loss of jobs across the broader U.S. economy.
A net loss.
Potentially as many as 75,000 jobs, as industries that use steel and aluminum shed jobs or scaled back hiring due to increased material costs. The Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond also noted a relative decline in employment in input-dependent industries following the 2018-19 tariffs.
So critics view these 232 actions as the U.S. essentially scoring economic own goals, hurting itself.
That's the analogy often used. They see Section 232 actions as economically self-damaging own goals, where any boost to a specific raw material sector is more than offset by pain spread throughout the much larger manufacturing and consumer parts of the economy.
And that could actually weaken security.
They argue this kind of economic inefficiency actually undermines U.S. growth and, perhaps ironically, could weaken national security by making the overall economy smaller, less dynamic, and less able to invest in future capabilities.
A major point of contention seems to be the very definition of national security itself under Section 232, how broad it is.
That's perhaps the most frequent and potent critique. Critics argue that the term national security in this statute is so loosely defined and can be interpreted so broadly that it can be invoked essentially for anything.
Which leads to the blank check concern.
Exactly. This, they contend, opens the door wide to abuse, and they call this the blank check concern.
Why is it a blank check? What makes it different from other trade tools in that regard?
Unlike other trade tools that might require findings of unfair trade practices, like dumping or subsidies, or a specific surge in imports causing injury, Section 232 only requires a subjective judgment by the executive branch about a potential threat to security.
Subjective judgment.
Critics argue this extreme flexibility makes it easy to use the security rationale as a loophole for protectionism.
And the use under the Trump administration is often cited as evidence of this, using it broadly.
Yes, the aggressive use of Section 232 during the Trump administration is frequently cited as a prime example of this alleged abuse. Tariffs were imposed on a broad range of imports, including significant amounts from close allies like Canada, the European Union, and Japan, using a security justification that critics saw as tenuous and not credible.
Was there any indication that the real reason might have been more about economics or leverage than genuine security? Did critics point to anything specific?
Critics point to internal documents and statements from the time, suggesting that economic motives, such as protecting domestic jobs or gaining negotiating leverage in unrelated disputes, were the primary drivers, with national security serving as a convenient pretext.
That's it.
Organizations like the Libertarian Cato Institute argued that this adventurous use stretched national security to cover what was blatant commercial protectionism, ultimately undermining U.S. credibility and potentially its actual security by alienating allies.
So the concern is that this broad definition means almost any industry could theoretically ask for protection under Section 232. Just find some security link.
That's the fear. Because the statute lacks a truly objective, narrowly defined standard, critics worry that virtually any industry, whether it's steel, autos, or hypothetically even less obvious sectors like appliances or footwear, could potentially lobby for protection by claiming some link, however distant, to national security or economic welfare critical for security.
Did Congress weigh in on this perceived overreach? Did they push back?
Absolutely. This broad application alarmed members of Congress from across the political spectrum who felt their constitutional authority over trade was being bypassed.
Bipartisan concern.
Yes, opposition to the Trump administration's Section 232 tariffs actually saw unusual bipartisan agreement in calls to rein in executive power. Several bills have been proposed in Congress specifically to tighten the definition of national security for trade purposes or require congressional approval before Section 232 actions can be implemented.
So the worry is it sidesteps Congress.
The core worry for critics is that without reform, the national security argument effectively becomes a blank check for the president to impose tariffs at will. They argue this is contrary to Congress's constitutional authority and deeply harmful to the rules-based global trading system that the U.S. itself helped build.
How have U.S. trading partners, especially allies, reacted to being targeted with Section 232 on national security grounds? They can't have liked that.
No, not at all. That brings us to another major area of criticism: the diplomatic and retaliatory backlash. Allies and trading partners were understandably angered by being labeled a security threat by the U.S., especially given deep economic and defense ties.
Like the situation with Canada. That seemed particularly rough.
Exactly. Canada, a close NATO ally and deeply integrated trading partner, was outraged at being subjected to steel and aluminum tariffs on national security grounds. They reasonably pointed out that Canadian steel and aluminum are integral to U.S. defense supply chains and military production.
And other affected countries didn't just accept these tariffs quietly, did they? They hit back.
No, they responded decisively. The European Union, Canada, Mexico, and other affected partners imposed retaliatory tariffs on a range of U.S. exports.
Targeting specific U.S. goods.
Yes, these counter tariffs often deliberately targeted politically sensitive American industries and products like Harley-Davidson motorcycles, Kentucky bourbon, and various agricultural products in an effort to impose political costs on the administration that implemented the Section 232 tariffs.
This tit for tat sounds like it could undermine actual national security by harming alliances, the opposite of the stated goal.
That's a key point made by critics. They argue this kind of retaliatory escalation actually harms U.S. national security by fraying alliances and distracting from common strategic challenges that require cooperation, not trade disputes with partners.
And it creates uncertainty for business.
Definitely. The risk of retaliation also creates significant uncertainty for U.S. businesses looking to export. While some of the retaliation was later suspended or replaced with quotas after negotiations, the episode clearly demonstrated that invoking national security doesn't grant immunity from consequences trading partners will push back, especially if they perceive the security claim as a pretext for protectionism.
And does this risk encouraging other countries to use similar justifications for their own protectionist measures? A copycat effect?
Yes, that's seen as a significant systemic risk. Critics worry that the U.S. using such a broad interpretation of national security sets a dangerous precedent that other countries will emulate.
Undermining the whole system.
Right. If a major player like the U.S. uses the security excuse to bypass trade commitments, others are likely to follow suit, leading to a breakdown in the predictability and stability of global trade rules.
Okay, let's check in. So, while proponents frame Section 232 as a vital shield for national security, critics counter that it's more of a costly sword being wielded improperly.
They point to clear economic harm. Higher costs spread across vast parts of the economy, the risk of net job losses when accounting for downstream industries.
Right.
The fundamental problem of the vague national security definition being used as a loophole for protectionism, and the significant diplomatic damage caused by targeting allies and sparking retaliation damage that critics argue actually harms U.S. security by weakening alliances.
It really does circle back to that question we raised earlier.
Yeah.
Based on these critiques, would you call this approach defense or disguised industrial policy? The debate over Section 232 is truly centered on that very distinction.
The core critique of Section 232 is that, despite its stated noble goal of protecting national security, its broad application has stretched its purpose so thin that it effectively becomes a tool for general protectionism,
causing more harm than good, potentially.
Critics argue this causes more economic harm than good, acting as a blunt instrument that damages relationships with allies, invites damaging retaliation, and undermines the very global trade rules the U.S. helped create, potentially leaving the nation worse off economically and strategically in the long run.
Here are some flashcard facts summarizing those key critiques.
Okay. Flashcard facts. Critiques. Economic costs and inefficiency.
Critique. Net job loss per PIE Richmond Fed.
That critique. Blank check, misused security rationale.
Oof, critique. Harm to downstream manufacturers.
Retaliatory backlash and damaged alliances.
It's security versus industrial policy. Key question. We've moved from the legal foundations and the theoretical arguments for and against these tools. Now let's ground this in the real world and look at how these measures, particularly Section 232 and Section 301, have impacted specific critical U.S. industries. Let's start with the most prominent example of Section 232 in action.
Steel.
Right. So in March 2018, a 25% tariff was imposed on most steel imports.
25%.
Yes. This followed the Department of Commerce's investigation, finding that these imports threaten national security, primarily by weakening the U.S. internal economy and eroding domestic production capacity needed for defense and critical infrastructure. The aim was to encourage U.S. steel production and increase mill capacity utilization to a healthier level, generally seen as around 80%.
Were there any initial adjustments or complications with those steel tariffs? Did it apply to everyone?
No, there were quite a few complications. Initially, countries like Canada, Mexico, and Australia were exempted, and other trading partners negotiated quotas instead of facing the full tariff.
Which creates loopholes. Exactly. This led to increased imports from those exempt countries and concerns about circumvention, for example, steel from tariffed countries being rerouted through exempt countries.
And companies could ask for specific exclusions too, right?
Yes, and the sheer volume of exclusion requests from U.S. companies needing specific types of steel not readily available domestically, over 288,000 by February 2021, for steel and aluminum combined, was seen by some as diluting the tariff's intended impact. It created a huge administrative process.
Were changes made later to try and tighten things up, address those loopholes?
Yes, there have been ongoing adjustments. The Trump administration, for example, announced significant changes in February 2025, aimed at restoring what they called a true 25% tariff.
What did those changes involve?
These reforms eliminated all country exemptions and what were called general approved exclusions, applied strict melted and poured standards to define where the steel truly originated, and expanded tariff coverage to certain downstream products containing steel.
So getting tougher over time?
This cycle of imposing tariffs, seeing workarounds, and then tightening them up is part of the policy's dynamic and adds, considerable uncertainty for businesses.
Okay, so with those tariffs in place, who specifically benefited from the steel tariffs? Did they help U.S. steelmakers?
The primary intended beneficiaries were domestic steel producers. The measures did lead to several positive outcomes for them, largely by reducing import competition.
What did the data show about imports? Did they actually go down?
Yes. The U.S. International Trade Commission, the USITC, in its 2023 report analyzing the period from 2018 to 2021, found that steel imports decreased by 24%.
24% drop.
Looking more broadly, overall steel and aluminum imports combined dropped by nearly 1/3 between 2016 and 2020. So yes, imports fell.
And did U.S. domestic steel production increase as a result?
The USITC reported a 1.9% increase in the value of U.S. steel production during 2018-2021, which amounted to $1.3 billion higher output in 2021 compared to what it might have been without the tariffs.
Did they hit that 80% capacity goal?
A key objective for the industry was to reach a sustainable capacity utilization rate of at least 80%. While the domestic steel industry briefly hit this target in 2021, utilization subsequently declined to 77.3% in 2022 and 75.3% in 2023.
Why'd the drop?
That drop was partly attributed to those high import volumes from exempted sources we mentioned. The February 2025 adjustments aim to help utilization get back towards that 80% goal.
Did domestic steel prices go up because of the tariffs? Were producers able to charge more?
Yes, U.S. market prices for steel products increased by an average of 2.4% during the 2018-2021 period, according to the U.S. ITC report. This price increase, shielded from lower-priced foreign competition, provided a direct benefit to domestic mill revenues.
And who ultimately paid those higher prices?
Well, the U.S. ITC report also noted that U.S. importers bore nearly the full cost of the tariffs, as import prices rose at approximately the same rate as the tariffs. This counters the idea sometimes floated that foreign exporters would just absorb the cost by lowering their prices.
So the cost was passed on. What about investment in jobs in the steel industry? Did the tariffs spur new activity?
Proponents argue the tariff spurred significant investment, claiming over $10 billion has been committed to new U.S. mill projects since 2018. They are also credited with creating thousands of jobs and raising wages in the domestic metals industry.
Any examples of that investment?
For example, Hyundai Steel has been reported to be considering building a plant in the U.S., a decision that could be influenced by the tariff environment. Even foreign interest in acquiring U.S. steel, like that from Nippon Steel, has been linked by company officials to the protective environment created by U.S. tariffs.
That's interesting. Tariffs encouraging foreign investment in the U.S.
It highlights how tariffs, while often aimed at reducing imports, can sometimes act as an incentive for foreign companies to invest directly in U.S. production to avoid those tariffs. However, it also raises considerations about foreign ownership of what's been deemed a strategically important domestic asset.
Right, the control issue.
Some sources note that accepting this kind of windfall funding through foreign acquisition might come with complexities regarding long-term control and profit repatriation.
So there seem to be pretty clear benefits for domestic steel producers. But who was harmed by these tariffs? There's always another side to the coin.
Absolutely. Despite the benefits to domestic steel producers, the tariffs imposed significant costs and burdens on a much broader segment of the U.S. economy, particularly the downstream manufacturing industries that use steel and ultimately consumers.
Downstream meaning industries like car makers or construction companies, the ones buying the steel.
Exactly. Manufacturers in sectors heavily reliant on steel, such as automotive, appliances, construction, heavy machinery, and agriculture, experienced substantial increases in their input costs.
Even if they bought American steel.
Yes. Organizations like the Coalition of American Metal Manufacturers and Users, CAMU, frequently highlighted that these tariffs drove up steel prices even for manufacturers trying to source domestically, as U.S. producers could raise prices in the absence of cheaper import options. This directly diminished the competitiveness of these U.S. manufacturers against global rivals who weren't facing these same elevated raw material costs.
Did those higher costs impact the production levels in those industries? Did they make less stuff?
Yes. The USITC found that the Section 232 tariffs on both steel and aluminum led to an average 0.6% decrease in production across downstream industries, translating to an estimated $3.5 billion less in output in 2021.
$3.5 billion less.
Some analyses suggest that the economic harm caused to these steel-consuming industries could potentially outweigh the benefits accrued by the smaller domestic steel-producing industry.
And the impact on jobs in those using industries, we touched on this earlier.
Yeah, the increased costs and reduced competitiveness in downstream sectors have led to significant concerns about job displacement. A common argument made by critics is that for every job potentially preserved in the steel manufacturing sector due to tariffs, several jobs may be jeopardized or lost in the much larger steel-consuming industries.
Any data on that?
The Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond noted a relative employment decline in industries heavily dependent on imported inputs following the 2018-19 tariffs.
And how did this affect consumers? Did we see it at the checkout?
Increased production costs for goods containing steel, such as automobiles, appliances, and construction materials, were frequently passed on to consumers in the form of higher retail prices.
What about the stability and certainty for businesses trying to plan?
Downstream manufacturers reported longer lead times for essential materials like steel. The inherent instability of tariff policies with frequent changes to exemptions, scope, and exclusion processes creates significant uncertainty for businesses.
The certainty deficit.
Right. It makes long-term planning, investment, and managing supply chains much more difficult. Navigating the administrative burden of exclusion requests, when possible, also added costs.
Let's turn to aluminum. How did Section 232 impact that industry compared to steel? Was it a similar story?
The pattern for aluminum was quite similar, yes. An initial 10% tariff on most aluminum imports was imposed in March 2018 under Section 232.
10% lower than steel initially.
Correct. Based on the same national security rationale, safeguarding a viable domestic aluminum industry deemed essential for security and countering global excess capacity, particularly from China. The Biden administration maintained these tariffs and later increased tariffs on Russian aluminum imports significantly to 200% in 2023.
Were there similar adjustments or expansions over time for aluminum tariffs like with steel?
Yes. In February 2025, the Trump administration announced an increase in the general aluminum tariff rate from 10% to 25%.
Matching steel.
Yes. These measures also eliminated all country exemptions and general approved exclusions, expanded product coverage to include certain aluminum derivative articles, and applied smelted and cast standards to define origin.
Okay, what are derivative articles for aluminum?
Think finished products like aluminum cans, foils, wires, or car parts, where the aluminum content is significant. That expansion to derivatives is particularly noteworthy.
How big an expansion was it?
While an earlier proclamation in 2020 covered derivatives worth about $457 million, the February 2025 proclamations expanded this scope dramatically to cover an estimated $150 billion in U.S. imports of goods where aluminum is a key component.
Wow, that's a huge jump in scope. That affects way more products.
It vastly broadens the range of industries directly affected by tariffs on the aluminum content of their products.
So who benefited from the aluminum tariffs? Was it meant to save the U.S. industry?
The tariffs were intended to provide a lifeline to the domestic aluminum industry, which had seen significant declines. Proponents argued they were crucial in saving the domestic primary aluminum industry from total collapse.
Did U.S. aluminum production increase? Did utilization rates go up?
The USITC found that the tariffs led to a 3.6% increase in the value of U.S. aluminum production, adding about $0.9 billion in 2021. Domestic primary aluminum capacity utilization did increase from a very low 40% in 2017 to 61% in 2019.
So it worked initially.
However, this trend reversed, with utilization falling back to 55% by 2023 despite the tariffs.
Why? Same reason as steel.
Yes, again attributed in part to high import volumes from countries that had been exempted. The February 2025 changes aim to address this issue of circumvention or displacement.
And did imports fall? You said they fell more than steel.
According to the USITC's analysis for 2018-2021, aluminum imports fell by 31%. Overall imports also decreased significantly between 2016 and 2020.
31% drop.
And yes, interestingly, the 31% reduction in aluminum imports was larger than the 24% reduction for steel, even though aluminum had a lower initial tariff rate.
Why would that be?
It could suggest that U.S. industries or consumers found it easier to substitute away from imported aluminum than from imported steel, or perhaps that the price responsiveness, the elasticity, was higher.
And what about prices for aluminum? Did they go up too?
The USITC reported that U.S. market prices for aluminum products rose, with estimates varying between 1.6% and 3.6% during the 2018-21 period due to the tariffs.
So similar to steel, there were benefits for domestic aluminum producers. Who was harmed on the aluminum side?
Just like with steel, the benefits to domestic aluminum producers were counterbalanced by negative impacts on a wide range of downstream industries that use aluminum and ultimately consumers.
Which industries use a lot of aluminum? Cans, cars?
Industries like beverage packaging, automotive, aerospace, building and construction, and consumer durables faced higher prices for aluminum inputs.
Did user groups complain?
Yes. CAMU, representing metal users, highlighted that tariffs increased aluminum prices even for companies trying to source domestically. The Cato Institute specifically noted that the Section 232 aluminum tariffs, combined with steel tariffs, disproportionately harms several U.S. motor vehicle and parts manufacturing sub-industries, contributing to reduced production in those sectors.
Did that hurt their ability to compete globally? Make U.S. goods more expensive?
Yes. U.S. manufacturers using aluminum found themselves paying significantly more for this essential raw material than their foreign competitors who weren't subject to the same tariffs. This eroded their competitiveness, particularly for small and medium-sized enterprises, some of whom reported losing contracts to overseas rivals because their costs were higher.
And consumers saw higher prices eventually, in things like cars or appliances.
Yes. Increased costs for aluminum used in a vast array of products, from soda cans to cars to household appliances, were typically passed on to end consumers, leading to higher retail prices.
Okay, so for both steel and aluminum, Section 232 tariffs clearly help domestic producers by reducing imports and increasing prices and production value. That seems clear,
Right.
but this seems to have come at a pretty significant cost to the much larger industries that use these metals as inputs, like automotive, construction, packaging, and many others, often resulting in reduced output and concerns about job losses in those sectors.
That's the key trade-off clearly illustrated by the Section 232 metal or tariffs. The USITC report, for example, found that while U.S. production of steel and aluminum increased by $1.3 billion and $0.9 billion respectively in 2021 due to 232 tariffs,
Big gains.
production in downstream industries using these metals actually decreased by $3.5 billion in the same year.
The losses were bigger.
It shows that boosting one sector can have substantial negative impacts on many others.
Let's turn to semiconductors, which are absolutely critical in today's economy. How have U.S. trade tools impacted the semiconductor industry? Has it been 232 or 301?
Semiconductors have become a major focal point for U.S. trade policy actions, driven by concerns about unfair foreign practices, supply chain vulnerabilities, and maintaining U.S. tech leadership. They've been primarily targeted through Section 301 tariffs aimed at China, and more recently through the initiation of a Section 232 national security investigation.
What were the Section 301 tariffs targeting China regarding semiconductors? When did those start?
Semiconductors imported from China were included in the broader Section 301 tariffs imposed starting in 2018.
Part of the big China tariffs?
Yes. These were specifically put in place to counter China's practices related to intellectual property theft, forced technology transfer, and state-sponsored cyber intrusions. Initial tariff rates range from 7.5% to 25%.
And they've been increased recently.
In May 2024, the USTR announced an extension of most of these tariffs and, for certain strategic goods, including semiconductors, implemented significantly increased tariff rates, going from 25% potentially up to 100%.
100%. I also heard there was a new Section 301 investigation specifically on legacy chips. What's the deal with that? That sounds important.
That's a particularly significant development, yes. In December 2024, USTR launched a new, separate Section 301 investigation, specifically targeting China's policies and practices concerning legacy or foundational semiconductors.
Legacy meaning older tech, not cutting edge.
Exactly. These are the less advanced, mature node chips that are used in almost everything: cars, appliances, industrial equipment, not the super high-end ones. This investigation is looking at their impact on critical U.S. industries. A key aspect here is that this investigation contemplates the possibility of component tariffs.
What does component tariffs mean? That sounds different.
It means tariffs could be levied not only on legacy chips imported directly from China, but also on downstream products like automotive components, industrial equipment, or consumer electronics imported from any country, if those products contain targeted China origin legacy chips.
Wait, so a product from, say, Vietnam could get hit with a tariff if it has a Chinese legacy chip inside?
That's the concept being explored. It would dramatically expand the reach of the tariffs and introduce enormous complexity into global supply chains that rely on these widely used chips.
And there's even been a Section 232 investigation started for semiconductors on national security grounds.
Correct. In April 2025, the Department of Commerce initiated a Section 232 investigation to determine if imports of semiconductors and semiconductor manufacturing equipment pose a threat to U.S. national security.
Why now?
This reflects growing concerns about U.S. reliance on foreign supply chains for these foundational technologies, particularly given China's increasing capabilities and state support for its domestic industry.
So with these different layers of tariffs and investigations, 301 on China chips, maybe component tariffs on legacy chips, and a 232 investigation, who are the beneficiaries in the semiconductor industry, is this helping U.S. chip makers?
Identifying clear beneficiaries from semiconductor tariffs is quite complex, and any benefits are often limited and highly contested among experts.
Why is that?
While a stated goal is to stimulate domestic production and reduce reliance, especially on China, the overall effectiveness and net benefit of tariffs in achieving this for such a globally integrated and complex industry are heavily debated.
Has there been any evidence that past tariffs boosted U.S. production? Did imports from China go down?
A USITC report analyzing the effects of Section 301 tariffs specifically as of March 2022 found that those earlier tariffs had reduced U.S. imports of semiconductors from China by 72.3%.
72%, that's a big drop.
Yes. The report also associated those tariffs with a 6.4% increase in the value of U.S. production of semiconductors. So there's some evidence of import substitution and production value increase from the earlier tariffs, but this is data from a specific period and scope.
Aren't these tariffs supposed to work together with efforts like the Chia GPS Act to encourage manufacturing in the U.S. bring production home?
Tariffs are often presented as a complementary tool alongside industrial policy initiatives like the GPS Act, aiming to encourage reshoring or diversification of semiconductor manufacturing away from geopolitical rivals.
But do experts agree it works that way?
Well, expert organizations like the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, IDIF, argue that blanket tariffs on semiconductors could actually be counterproductive to these goals.
Counterproductive? How?
They contend that shifting semiconductor manufacturing back to the US is incredibly complex, capital intensive, taking over 5 years to build a new advanced factory, for example, and depends on numerous factors beyond tariffs, such as a skilled workforce, extensive infrastructure, and a favorable regulatory environment.
So tariffs alone aren't enough.
Not only that, IDIF specifically argues that tariffs could hinder domestic investment by making it more expensive to import the highly specialized manufacturing equipment and materials needed to build and operate U.S. chip fabs.
Oh, so the tariffs hit the stuff to make chips in the U.S.
Potentially, yes. This raises a potential conflict. Trade policy actions intended to boost domestic production might inadvertently undermine industrial policy objectives by raising costs for that very production.
So if the benefits are contested, who is harmed by these semiconductor tariffs? It sounds like the downsides could be significant.
The potential negative impacts of broad semiconductor tariffs are arguably much more widespread, affecting a vast array of downstream industries that rely on chips, consumers, and potentially stifling U.S. innovation and broader economic growth.
Semiconductors are fundamental components in everything, pretty much.
Exactly. They are essential inputs in consumer electronics, automotive systems, medical devices, artificial intelligence infrastructure, data centers, aerospace technology, and virtually all modern manufacturing. Tariffs on semiconductors directly translate to higher input costs for all of these U.S. industries that use them.
And that makes U.S. companies less competitive globally.
Yes. Facing higher costs for such fundamental components makes U.S. manufactured goods less competitive globally, both in export markets and potentially even domestically against imports not subject to the same input costs.
Any specific examples?
IDIF, for instance, projects that a 25% tariff on semiconductors could reduce U.S. competitiveness in the critical AI sector and potentially lead to ceding global market share as data centers and AI model training become more expensive in the U.S.
And consumers feel this impact directly through higher prices for phones, computers, etc.
Tariffs on semiconductors and the vast range of products that contain them inevitably lead to higher prices for consumers. IDIF estimates that a sustained 25% tariff on semiconductors would reduce the average American's living standards by $122 in the first year, with a cumulative loss of $4,208 over 10 years due to increased costs for electronics and other chip-reliant goods.
Wow, over $4,000 per person over a decade. What about the broader economic impact, GDP?
ITIF's analysis projects that a sustained 25% blanket tariff on semiconductor imports could decrease U.S. GDP growth by 0.18% in the first year, and, if maintained, by 0.76% in the 10th year.
That adds up.
This would equate to a cumulative loss of $1.4 trillion in U.S. GDP over a decade. Their study also forecasts a net loss in U.S. tax revenues due to decreased economic activity.
Could these tariffs stifle innovation, make companies less likely to invest in R&D?
Increased costs for essential components and heightened supply chain uncertainty can definitely deter investment in research and development across all chip-using sectors, potentially stifling innovation. ITIF argues that tariffs on a globally sourced, non-readily substitutable good, like semiconductors, act as a tax on capital formation and innovation, which are crucial for technological advancement.
Will these tariffs actually succeed in causing manufacturing to shift out of China significantly and quickly? Is that happening?
Organizations like the Consumer Technology Association, CTA, are skeptical that tariffs alone will dramatically accelerate manufacturing shifts out of China.
Why not?
They note that companies are already diversifying due to a confluence of other factors, including geopolitical risks and lessons learned from the pandemic. They suggest that tariffs might instead simply increase costs for U.S. companies who are already attempting these complex transitions, potentially delaying them rather than accelerating them.
And that new focus on legacy chips, the ones used everywhere, what's the risk there?
The new Section 301 investigation on legacy chips presents a particularly complex dilemma. These mature node chips are indispensable in a vast range of products, from automotive systems and industrial controls to common consumer electronics. China has a significant and growing presence in this market.
So hitting them could have wide effects.
Tariffs on these widely used and often lower margin chips, especially if applied as component tariffs to finished goods from any country, could have a pervasive inflationary impact across numerous sectors because there isn't easily or quickly available substitute production capacity outside of China for many of these chips at the scale needed by global industry.
Okay, so for semiconductors, the picture is much less clear-cut than with steel and aluminum. While there's some past evidence of tariffs being associated with increased U.S. production value, many experts warn that broad tariffs could significantly harm the vast industries that use chips,
Right, raising costs for businesses and consumers?
reducing U.S. competitiveness across the economy, potentially slowing innovation, and damaging overall economic growth.
And as IDEF argues, this could potentially work against rather than complement goals like boosting domestic chip manufacturing via the CHPS Act. The focus on legacy chips adds another layer of potential broad economic impact due to their ubiquitous use.
Let's look at the automotive industry. It sounds like it's been hit by a combination of these tariffs, maybe more than any other sector.
It has indeed. The U.S. automotive industry is facing a multi-layered challenge. It's been impacted by Section 232 tariffs on essential materials like steel and aluminum.
The inputs.
It's been subject to direct Section 232 investigations and potential tariffs on imported vehicles and parts.
The finished goods.
And it's affected by Section 301 tariffs on various components, particularly those sourced from China.
So hitting them from multiple angles. How did the steel and aluminum tariffs affect car makers specifically?
The initial 25% tariff on steel and the 10% later increased tariff on aluminum directly increased input costs for automotive manufacturing, a sector that relies heavily on these metals.
Do we know how much?
The Center for Automotive Research estimated that the Section 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum cost U.S. light vehicle manufacturers nearly $500 million annually, even before the more recent adjustments and expansions.
$500 million a year, just from those.
These tariffs also led to decreased availability and longer lead times for certain automotive-grade steel. A 2023 USITC report specifically found that these tariffs disproportionately harmed 6 different U.S. motor vehicle and parts manufacturing sub-industries, leading to reduced production in those areas.
There was also a specific Section 232 investigation just on automobiles and parts, right? Not just the materials.
Yes. The Trump administration initiated one, concluding in 2019 that imports threaten national security. Concerns cited included stagnant U.S. share of global automobile production.
Did they put tariffs on them?
While tariffs weren't immediately applied broadly then, subsequent proclamations in March 2025 mandated 25% tariffs on all vehicle imports, with exemptions for U.S. content in USMCA-compliant vehicles, and 25% tariffs on certain automobile parts.
25% on imported cars and parts. And Section 301 tariffs on Chinese auto parts and electric vehicles. Those are separate.
Yes. Various automotive parts imported from China have been subject to Section 301 tariffs since 2018 as part of the broader measures against China. Furthermore, the USTR actions announced in May 2024 included significantly increased tariffs, potentially ranging up to 100% on specific Chinese goods, notably electric vehicles or EVs and EV batteries.
So the auto industry is facing what some might call a triple whammy of tariffs on raw materials, components, and potentially finished vehicles.
That's a good way to put it. Tariffs applied at multiple layers on raw materials like steel and aluminum, on components sourced globally, including from China, and then potentially on finished vehicles, create a compounding negative effect on production costs and introduce significant instability into the sector's complex supply chains.
Who benefits from these tariffs on the auto industry? Is the goal to boost U.S. car manufacturing?
The stated goal of applying tariffs on autos and auto parts is similar to other cases: reduce imports, strengthen the U.S. industrial base, and encourage domestic manufacturing. Some labor unions have expressed support for such measures.
But is there evidence it's actually working?
While evidence of clear, widespread, tangible benefits to overall U.S. auto production and employment directly attributable to these specific tariff actions is limited and often overshadowed by the documented harms.
Why is it? Especially given the integrated North American market.
The North American automotive industry in particular has a highly integrated supply chain, with parts and subassemblies crossing borders multiple times during production. Tariffs imposed in this environment can disrupt these efficient co-production models, potentially harming the overall competitiveness of the integrated North American industry against manufacturing hubs in other regions of the world.
And the harms. Who gets hurt in the automotive sector? It sounds widespread.
The negative repercussions are extensive, impacting domestic auto manufacturers, parts suppliers, consumers, and the broader economy.
How much do costs go up for manufacturers?
As we mentioned, the initial Section 232 steel and aluminum tariffs were estimated to cost U.S. light vehicle manufacturers nearly $500 million annually just in higher input costs. Direct tariffs on imported components and finished vehicles further escalate production costs for manufacturers, regardless of whether they are U.S.-based companies importing parts or foreign automakers importing vehicles into the U.S.
How does that impact car buyers? What does it mean for the sticker price?
These increased costs for manufacturers are largely passed on to consumers. Industry analysts have estimated that a combination of potential auto tariffs could increase the average price of an imported vehicle by anywhere from $5,000 to $11,000, depending on the vehicle's origin and the specific structure of the tariffs applied.
$5,000 to $11,000 more per car. That's huge.
It significantly reduces affordability for consumers.
And U.S. auto manufacturing competitiveness. Does it help or hurt?
Facing higher input costs for materials and components, coupled with disrupted supply chains, makes U.S.-based automotive manufacturing less competitive globally compared to operations not facing these same tariff burdens.
What about the complexity of automotive supply chains? You mentioned parts crossing borders.
The deep integration, especially across North America, means parts might cross the border multiple times. Tariffs applied at each crossing, or just the uncertainty about future tariffs, can multiply costs exponentially,
creating chaos for planning.
This creates an environment of extreme uncertainty for businesses trying to manage these complex networks, and could potentially lead to costly disruptions or even temporary shutdowns. As ORF America put it, there is extreme uncertainty for businesses, which face a high risk of disruptions and possible plant shutdowns.
Does this create jobs in the long run, or does it potentially eliminate existing ones by making things less efficient?
Critics argue that rather than creating significant numbers of new U.S. jobs, disrupting these established, efficient production networks can actually endanger existing employment by making American manufacturing less competitive overall.
Any research on?
ORF America points to past research on tariffs in other industries, like washing machines, where each protected job came at an enormous cost to consumers and led to job destruction in linked industries. They also suggest that if foreign manufacturers do decide to relocate production to the U.S. to avoid tariffs, they are likely to build highly automated plants, potentially resulting in fewer, not more, American automotive manufacturing jobs overall.
Fewer jobs, even with relocation, and the risk of retaliation from other auto-producing countries. Germany, Japan, Korea.
This is a major concern. Key U.S. trading partners like Canada, Mexico, the EU, Japan, and South Korea are all major automotive exporters to the U.S. If the U.S. were to widely apply tariffs on their auto exports, it is highly likely they would respond with retaliatory tariffs on U.S. exports across various sectors, harming other parts of the American economy.
The situation with Canada and Mexico seems particularly complicated given the USMCA trade agreement. Weren't tariffs supposed to go away?
It is complicated. The imposition or threat of tariffs on automotive goods from Canada and Mexico has been criticized as directly contradicting the spirit and even the letter of the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA.
Which was supposed to remove tariffs.
Right, an agreement that was negotiated by the same administration that later imposed or threatened these tariffs. The Cato Institute emphasizes that these tariffs, even on vehicles assembled in Mexico, significantly harm U.S. companies and workers because a substantial portion of the value in those vehicles originates from U.S.-made content and U.S. companies, including the Detroit automakers themselves who have assembly plants in Mexico.
So it hurts U.S. companies too. And how does this impact the push for electric vehicles? Does it help or hinder the transition?
The ongoing transition to electric vehicles introduces another layer of complexity. While U.S. policy aims to encourage domestic EV adoption and manufacturing, tariffs on critical EV components sourced from China, such as batteries and certain semiconductors, already covered under Section 301 and potentially on imported EVs themselves, could inadvertently slow this transition.
How would it slow it down?
Higher costs for these essential components in vehicles would make EVs more expensive for both U.S. producers and consumers, potentially dampening adoption rates and conflicting with broader environmental and energy security objectives related to moving away from fossil fuels.
So tariffs could make EVs less affordable. Some groups have characterized this quite strongly, haven't they?
Yes, ORF America characterizes the potential auto tariffs as economic self-harm disguised as national security, predicting substantial price distortions and immediate painful impacts on American consumers through higher prices and reduced purchasing power. They warn of a risk of broader economic contraction resulting from such actions. The Congressional Research Service also notes that auto industry groups have consistently warned that tariffs could negatively affect the U.S. economy and highlighted the significant risk of retaliation from trading partners.
This has been incredibly detailed, showing the real-world consequences and trade-offs in critical industries. Let's do a mega recap for this chapter before we look at the overall picture.
Okay. What we've seen is that for foundational industries like steel and aluminum, Section 232 tariffs have indeed provided clear benefits to domestic producers, boosting production, raising prices, and reducing imports. But this has come at a significant cost to the much larger downstream manufacturing industries that rely on those materials, like automotive, construction, and packaging.
And for more complex sectors like semiconductors and automotive, which were affected by both Section 232 and Section 301 tariffs, the picture is arguably more challenging, maybe even worse. Analyses in these sectors project widespread negative impacts, including increased costs for businesses and consumers, reduced U.S. competitiveness globally, potential supply chain chaos, and job loss concerns across vast parts of the economy.
And importantly, these impacts can sometimes even contradict other strategic goals, like promoting EV adoption or boosting overall economic growth. It's a clear, powerful illustration of the complex economic trade-offs involved when using these tools. Gains concentrated in one sector often appear to be outweighed by costs spread across many others, including the end consumer.
Here are some flashcard facts summarizing who gains and who pays in these key industries.
Flashcard facts. Steel, aluminum, 232. Beneficiaries, domestic producers. Harmed, downstream MSRs.
SMEs, 301, 232, and B. Beneficiaries, limited contested. Harmed, downstream industries, consumers, innovation, econ growth.
Auto, 232, 301. Beneficiaries, highly contested, limited, harmed, auto MSRs, suppliers, consumers, economy, triple whammy.
The key trade-off, upstream gains versus downstream costs. We've looked at the specific impacts on industries like steel, aluminum, semiconductors, and autos. Now let's step back even further and look at the wider ripples these tariff actions have across the entire U.S. economy and on international relations. Where do we see the broadest impact?
Well, one of the most consistent findings across numerous economic analyses is that U.S. consumers bear a significant portion of the costs associated with these tariffs.
How exactly do consumers feel this impact? Is it just higher prices?
Primarily, yes. Tariffs are essentially a tax on imported goods. Studies by the USITC and the Federal Reserve consistently indicate that these costs are largely passed through by importers to consumers in the form of higher prices for a wide array of goods.
Do we know how quickly prices go up?
Research from the Federal Reserve on the 2018-19 tariffs, for example, found a statistically significant increase in prices for consumer goods, with the full cost of the tariff largely appearing in consumer prices within 2 months of implementation.
2 months. Okay.
And this hits goods that are directly targeted by tariffs, but also a vast range of products that use tariff materials or components in their production. Think anything made with steel, aluminum, or semiconductors.
Is that impact felt evenly across different households? Or does it hit some harder?
Tariffs often have a regressive effect, meaning they disproportionately burden lower-income households.
Why is that?
Essential goods, which constitute a larger percentage of spending for these households, may see price increases, which can erode their purchasing power more significantly than for higher-income households.
So higher prices across the board mean less purchasing power for everyone, but especially for those with less income.
Yes, higher prices for a range of goods reduce overall consumer purchasing power. This can lead to decreased demand for goods and services across the economy, potentially dampening broader economic activity and growth. The Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond, for instance, noted that the 2018-19 tariffs contributed to losses for consumers.
What about the overall impact on those downstream manufacturers we talked about, the companies that use the tariff goods as inputs? We saw specifics in auto and steel, but what's the general picture?
This is a consistent negative theme across many sectors affected by these tariffs. There's a clear and documented rise in production costs for manufacturers that rely on essential inputs like steel, aluminum, semiconductors, various chemicals, and other tariffed goods.
Squeezing their profits.
It squeezes margins unless companies can successfully pass them on to their customers, which isn't always possible in competitive markets.
And this impacts their ability to compete globally, right? If their costs are higher.
Absolutely. When U.S. downstream producers face significantly higher input costs than their foreign competitors, who are not subject to the same tariffs on raw materials or components, Their ability to compete effectively, both in international export markets and even against imports within the U.S., is diminished. The Hudson Institute, for example, has highlighted this reduction in competitiveness.
What about disruptions and just general uncertainty in supply chains? How big a deal is that?
This is a major complaint from affected industries. The imposition of tariffs, especially when subject to frequent changes in scope, rates, exemptions, and evolving exclusion processes, creates significant policy uncertainty.
A certainty deficit, again.
Exactly. This certainty deficit, as some industry groups call it, makes long-term business planning, investment decisions, and managing complex global supply chains incredibly difficult.
Constantly changing rules.
Companies are forced to constantly reevaluate their sourcing strategies based on costs, lead times, and availability, often incurring considerable expense and administrative burden, particularly when trying to navigate tariff exclusion processes. GIMU has specifically noted this creates instability.
And the overall impact on employment across the whole U.S. economy. Does the picture look different when you step back from just the directly protected industries? We heard about net job losses earlier.
Yes, it often does look different. While tariff protection may lead to job gains or preservation in the specific upstream industries being shielded, like steel or aluminum mills, the increased costs and reduced output in the much larger downstream sectors that use those inputs can lead to net job losses or slower employment growth for the economy as a whole.
Any estimates on the scale?
The Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond estimated that the 2018-19 tariffs resulted in a relative employment decline of about 1.8%. Roughly 220,000 jobs in industries heavily dependent on imported inputs. They estimated this number rose to an even higher 2.6%, or about 320,000 jobs, when the effects of retaliatory tariffs from other countries were also factored in.
320,000 jobs potentially lost or not created due to tariffs and retaliation. You mentioned retaliatory tariffs earlier. How significant is that consequence? Is it a sure thing?
Retaliation is a predictable and significant consequence. Countries targeted by U.S. tariffs, including both major rivals like China and key allies, have consistently responded by levying their own tariffs on U.S. exports.
What kinds of U.S. goods get hit?
U.S. agricultural products like soybeans, corn, and pork, and iconic manufactured goods like motorcycles and bourbon have frequently been prominent targets.
And that directly hurts U.S. exporters. They lose sales.
It significantly reduces market access for U.S. goods abroad. Retaliatory tariffs make U.S. goods more expensive in foreign markets, leading directly to lost sales, reduced market share for American exporters, and forcing overseas customers to shift to alternative suppliers from countries not facing those tariffs.
What about the role of tariff exclusions? Were they effective in softening some of these negative impacts? Could companies get around the tariffs?
To try and mitigate some of the negative impacts on domestic companies that couldn't source necessary inputs domestically, the government did establish exclusion processes for both Section 232 and Section 301 tariffs.
How did that work for Section 232 steel and aluminum?
The Department of Commerce created a process allowing U.S. businesses to request exclusions from steel and aluminum tariffs for specific items if they could show that item wasn't produced in the U.S. in sufficient quantity, in good enough quality, or in a timely manner.
Did many companies apply?
Oh, yes. This process was absolutely inundated with requests, as we mentioned, over 288,000 for steel and aluminum by February 2021 alone. The process involved public comment, often allowing domestic producers to object.
Is that process still active?
Well, recent revisions to the Section 232 measures in February 2025 for steel and aluminum included terminating all general approved exclusions and prohibiting commerce from even considering new product exclusion requests, although specific exclusions already granted remain effective until they expire.
So they shut down the exclusion process for new requests.
For 232 steel and aluminum, yes. It signals a move towards a much more stringent and less flexible application of these tariffs going forward.
And for Section 301 exclusions on Chinese goods, was there a similar process?
USTR also implemented processes for requesting product-specific exclusions from the Section 301 tariffs imposed on goods from China. Over 2,200 exclusions were initially granted for the first sets of tariffs, but approval rates reportedly declined for later tariff lists.
Is that process working well for businesses?
Industry groups, like the American Chemistry Council, have consistently advocated for a more regular, transparent, and predictable exclusion process, arguing that the current ad hoc nature is incredibly difficult for businesses trying to plan and manage supply chains.
So while exclusions provided relief for some companies, they also seem to add complexity and maybe weren't applied consistently.
Yes, that's the tension. While exclusions can provide critical, sometimes essential relief for individual companies facing specific supply constraints, They can also potentially undermine the intended broad protective effect of the tariffs, and if applied inconsistently, could create an uneven playing field among domestic competitors. The recent changes, like terminating the Section 232 exclusion process for new requests, signal a move towards a more rigid application of these tariffs, potentially reducing relief, but perhaps making the policy less complex to administer.
Given all these different impacts we've discussed on specific industries, on consumers, on downstream manufacturers, on exporters, what's the overall net economic effect for the U.S. economy? Does it help or hurt overall?
That's where the debate becomes highly contentious among economists and policymakers. The cumulative effect of imposing these tariffs, facing retaliatory countermeasures from trading partners, and dealing with the associated policy uncertainty is fiercely debated.
So do the benefits outweigh the costs overall? Is there a consensus?
Not really a consensus, but while domestic producers of the tariffed goods clearly benefit from reduced import competition and often see higher domestic prices and increased production, numerous analyses suggest that these gains are often offset or even outweighed by the costs imposed on the much larger downstream industries that use those inputs, on consumers through higher prices, and on exporters who face retaliation.
You mentioned the USITC numbers earlier.
Right. As we noted, the USITC in its 2023 report focusing on Section 232 impacts in 2021 found that while U.S. production of steel and aluminum increased by $1.3 billion and $0.9 billion respectively due to the tariffs,
The benefit.
production in downstream industries using these metals as inputs decreased by a larger amount, $3.5 billion, in the same year. While the USITC explicitly stated its report wasn't a full economy-wide net benefit assessment, other analyses, such as the one from the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond covering the 2018-19 tariffs and retaliation, concluded a net loss to the U.S. economy.
A net loss overall. And finally, how have these tariffs impacted international relations, especially with allies?
The imposition of tariffs, particularly Section 232 measures on national security grounds against long-standing allies, has undeniably strained diplomatic and economic relationships.
Canada, the EU.
Canada and the EU were particularly vocal in their objections to being labeled security threats and responded with retaliatory tariffs. This kind of friction can complicate broader U.S. geopolitical and economic objectives that depend heavily on strong alliances.
Like working together on other issues.
Exactly. Such as collaborative efforts to address global trade imbalances, build trusted supply chains with partners, or present a united front on other strategic challenges. As the February 2025 changes to Section 232 were announced, they were met with warnings from trading partners about potential negative impacts and the risk of escalation.
So stepping back from all the details, these tariffs are like throwing a significant rock into a pond. The ripples extend far beyond the initial splash in the targeted industries.
Exactly. Consumers feel it through higher prices, downstream industries face significant cost increases and crippling uncertainty, and exporters get hit by retaliation that costs them market share.
While the intent is often stated as protecting specific sectors or countering specific foreign actions, the net effect on the broader U.S. economy is highly debated, with many analyses pointing to significant costs that may outweigh the concentrated benefits, all while potentially straining vital international relationships.
Here are some flashcard facts to sum up these cross-cutting impacts.
Okay, flashcard facts. A, consumers pay higher prices.
Downstream MFRs, higher input costs, reduced competitiveness, uncertainty,
Our exporters.
hit by retaliation.
Net economic impact. Highly debated. Many analyses show net loss. G. Richmond Fed.
International relations, strained, is Friday with allies. Hashtag tag outro. This has been a really deep dive into the mechanisms and impacts of Section 232 and Section 301 tariffs. We've unpacked the core differences. Section 232, driven by a broad national security definition that includes economic welfare, giving the president very wide discretion and no automatic sunset.
Right. And Section 301 targeting unfair trade practices managed by USTR with specific mandatory action possibilities and that 4-year review clause.
And we've seen the real-world consequences for industries like steel and aluminum, where domestic producers saw benefits from reduced competition, increased production, and higher prices.
But crucially, these benefits came at a significant cost to the much larger downstream industries that use those materials, often resulting in reduced output and jobs elsewhere in the economy. For more complex sectors like semiconductors and automotive, which are affected by multiple layers of these tariffs, the picture is even more challenging. Analyses often project widespread economic harm, including increased costs for businesses and consumers, reduced U.S. competitiveness across the economy, supply chain chaos, and job loss concerns.
and potentially working against other strategic goals like EV adoption.
These tools really represent a noticeable shift in U.S. trade policy towards a more assertive, sometimes unilateral approach, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. This marks a departure from a sole reliance on multilateral frameworks like the WTO, particularly when the U.S. seeks to address practices by non-market economies or what it sees as limitations in existing global rules.
There's a significant ongoing debate about their long-term impact on the domestic industrial landscape. Are these tariffs fostering genuine revitalization of strategic industries, or are they simply creating a higher cost, potentially less innovative economy that's less competitive globally?
Many argue their efficacy in truly addressing structural issues is limited unless accompanied by broader, more targeted strategic initiatives. The Hudson Institute touched on this.
And their use has definite implications for the global trade order, right? Risking copycats.
Yes. Unilateral actions, particularly when justified by broad national security claims against allies, strain relationships, raise questions about the U.S.'s commitment to international rules, and risk fragmentation as other nations potentially emulate these tactics.
There's also that key tension we discussed between the stated goal of enhancing supply chain resilience and the economic costs and disruptions imposed by the tariffs themselves.
Right. While intended to reduce dependence, tariffs can disrupt existing efficient supply chains, raise costs for domestic industries, and potentially harm relationships with the very international partners the U.S. might need to cooperate with to build truly diversified and resilient networks. IDF raised concerns about this.
So are they the best tool for resilience?
That's the question. Are they the most effective tool compared to, say, targeted investment or cooperation with allies?
Ultimately, a central question that emerges from examining these tools is their long-term effectiveness and overall viability in achieving strategic goals, where altering foreign practices, ensuring industry strength, or enhancing security when weighed against the documented economic costs, market disruptions, and risks of retaliation.
And the need for ongoing, sometimes reactive adjustments to the policies, like we saw with the exemptions and derivatives, suggest the challenge in achieving precise, sustainable, and broadly beneficial outcomes without significant unintended consequences.
In conclusion, while Section 232 and Section 301 offer the U.S. government direct legal means to address perceived threats and protect domestic industries, their application in practice involves significant economic trade-offs.
Benefits for a few concentrated sectors often come at the expense of broader economic costs that are dispersed across consumers, downstream industries, and U.S. exporters, all while potentially straining vital international relationships.
Any comprehensive assessment of their long-term utility must carefully weigh these concentrated benefits against their dispersed but often substantial costs, and consider how they fit within a broader, coherent national economic and security strategy.
And that leaves us with a provocative final thought for you, the listener, to consider building on all the complexities we've discussed. Given the documented economic trade-offs, the differing views on their effectiveness, and the potential diplomatic strains, can strategic tariffs like those imposed under Section 232 and 301 truly enhance long-term national security? Or do the economic costs and the damage to alliances ultimately make the nation less secure?
It's a complex balance, and one that continues to profoundly shape global power dynamics and economic policy. What stands out to you as the most important takeaway from this deep dive?
The cases may have seemed niche, focused on legal procedure, delegation clauses, and statutory ambiguity. But every one of them targets a deeper question. Who writes the rules when trade becomes a weapon? And while lawsuits chip away at agency power, a much larger shift was underway, one that didn't come from litigation, but from the Supreme Court itself. Next episode, we reveal our research on the new era of economic statecraft and trade tensions. Stay tuned.
Please like and subscribe.